Joseph Farrell is probably one of the most brilliant people alive today, and he's written so many books. And if you get a chance to go to, I guess it's GizaDeathStar.com, isn't that correct?
Yeah, that's right. There's a web store there with all of my books. They have to click the actual books rather than the Kindle tab because not all the books are on Kindle, and I don't like Kindle anyway. So,
Oh, you don't like it? No.
no,
No.
I'm a hard copy guy. I just don't trust corporations not to mess with text. So, so
Understood. Some of the titles of Dr. Joseph Farrell's books, the Giza Death Star, the Giza Death Star Deployed, Reich of the Black Sun, the SS Brotherhood of the Bell, the Cosmic War, Secrets of the Unified Field, the Philosopher's Stone. It goes on and on. He's done an incredible amount of work. One of the books that I think kind of disappeared a little bit inside of your gigantic amount of work is the Thrice Great Hermetica and the Janus Age. Really incredible book, and I think I heard one interview that you did on it. The Hermetica, we're curious about Atlantis lately. And I thought that I might be able to ask you just a question about how does the Hermetica fit in to Atlantis, and how does Atlantis fit in with the Nazis? Because it seems like the Nazis were obsessed with finding Atlantis. It seems like that drove a lot of what they were doing. And yeah.
Well, it's probably easiest to tackle the Nazis and Atlantis first. There were a number of esoteric and occult influences, as most people know, on the Nazi Party during its formative years before they actually took power. One particular fellow, Horbiger, propagated the world ice theory, and this was something that Himmler and some of the Nazi elite bought into, but certainly not all of the Nazi elite. You're also dealing with some hardcore pragmatists like Hermann Goering, at the top of the Nazi hierarchy. And he was hardly, a person interested in what he would have regarded as myths and fairy tales and so on and so forth. He was just kind of a nuts and bolts technology guy. But I mention him in this respect because Goering and Rudolf Hess, prior to the war, Rudolf Hess was the Reichsleiter of the Nazi Party, of course, and deputy Führer in the Nazi hierarchy. So in other words, he was by law, until Hitler designated Goering as his successor, he was more or less the guy that was slated to take over the Nazi Party. And of course, his secretary was one Martin Bormann, a notorious figure that I'm sure everybody knows or has heard about. And he eventually succeeds Hess when Hess runs off to Great Britain on that crazy peace mission in May of 1941. But Hess definitely was a man that was interested in the occult, in esoteric literature and lore and legends like Atlantis and so on. So it's very interesting that you have these two gentlemen, Rudolf Hess and Hermann Goering, that sponsored the the German expedition to Antarctica that traveled down to Antarctica in the autumn of 1938, specially outfitted. They even got Admiral Byrd from this country to come over and lecture the Nazi expedition people on the conditions that they would expect to find in Antarctica and so on and so forth. So there's even a connection of this expedition to the post-war expedition of Admiral Byrd, because, of course, he goes down there with Operation High Jump in 1947, returns. It's outfitted for 8 months, and he returns after a few weeks, gives a very strange interview on the way back to a reporter from Il Mercurio of Santiago de Chile, talking about, the United States is going to have to prepare to defend itself against enemy fighters that can fly from pole to pole with tremendous speed. And this is reported in the El Mercurio. I actually have a photograph of the article I believe it's in my book, The Nazi International. So anyway, this gave rise, of course, to all sorts of mythologies within the alternative research community that Admiral Byrd's forces had either encountered extraterrestrial UFOs down there or some sort of Nazi hidden flying saucer research base, which, again, is one of those myths that's out there. I do not subscribe to it. I want to make that absolutely clear. But it is clear that the Germans went to Antarctica in 1938 and 39. The expedition returned to Germany in 1939 as the war clouds were gathering for the Second World War. So the real question is, why do you have someone like Hermann Goering, who, of course, founds the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe? He founds the Gestapo. He is in charge of the Nazi economic and rearmament plans. And Rudolf Hess, on the other hand, a guy that's up to his earlobes in occult doctrine and occult connections and so on and so forth. Why are these two men sponsoring this expedition? And I do suspect that when you look at Antarctica itself, if there is any place on the surface of this planet that could fulfill the basic requirements of the Atlantis legend, as Plato outlined it in the Critias and Timaeus, it would be Antarctica, because it's an entire continent that quite literally is submerged underwater. That is to say, under lots and lots of ice. So I do think that there's this hidden Nazi connection, or hidden esoteric connection to the Nazi expedition, and it may have played a hidden motivation to that. The trouble is, we know very little about that expedition, because when it returned to Nazi Germany, Goering had a medallion struck to commemorate the expedition, and of course the crew members were given medallions, and it was briefly reported on the Deutsche Wochenschau, the weekly newsreels throughout Germany. But after that, you didn't hear anything more about it, and pretty much everything that the expedition may have discovered was probably classified by the Nazis, which is why it's so difficult to find out anything about it that has a provenance in terms of evidentiary value that you can trust to use for it. There have been reports of occasional newsreels and films that appear occasionally on the internet, but it's difficult to assess whether they're legitimate or not. So we're left questioning. But I do think, given Hess's involvement, his interest in the occult, and then, of course, given Heinrich Himmler's extreme interest in occult and esoteric matters, that this may indeed have been one of the motivations for the Nazis to go down there. I suspect that if that is true, then you're dealing with another speculation that they were perhaps looking for potential lost technology of that civilization. So there is a Nazi connection here. The more difficult part of your question is the Hermetica. Is there a connection of that body of literature to Atlantis? And right up front, you have to acknowledge that the Hermetica itself makes very, very few, if any, outright allusions to it. However, the Hermetica do claim to be the writings and wisdom that was passed down through the ages in Egypt from the lost wisdom god Tehuda, who, according to the legends, stored all of his knowledge of science and mathematics and so on two pillars. And of course, that has raised speculation that the Great Pyramid and some of the other pyramids were these pillars. The problem with the Hermetica, as I pointed out in that book, was that the Renaissance humanists in Italy, Cosimo de' Medici, was in fact the man that paid money for the Greek texts of the Hermetica and then eventually published them in Italy. They had been handed down, and there were bits and pieces of the Hermetica that were known in Western Europe prior to his publication of them. But the entire text was a different matter, and this is what he got his hands on and eventually published. The tendency of the Renaissance at that time was to take the Hermetica texts at their word, that they did indeed represent the lost teachings of Egypt. And of course, this caused a firestorm, if you want to put it that way, of controversy at the time. And eventually, because the Hermetica were so influential during the Renaissance, an English scholar by the name of Isaac Casaubon delved into the question of their authenticity. And he made a case, and quite a very good one, that there were the presence of Greek words in the Hermetica that dated no earlier than the 2nd century AD. So in other words, they couldn't, they weren't even as old as Plato. So they couldn't possibly be something handed down from ancient Egypt and the ancient Egyptian wisdom god. And their matters rested academically, more or less, since the Renaissance, up until about 2 to 3 decades ago. What Casaubon's study did is it essentially drove Hermetic thinking and the texts themselves back underground for quite a period of time, because the humanists could no longer appeal to them as a body of text that predated the biblical text. This is essentially what happened. The interesting thing is that modern scholars, many of them coming out of Oxford, have re-examined Casaubon's argument, and they have pointed out its fundamental flaw, which is a very modern one, and it's almost taken for granted. We have the idea that if you write a text and put your name on it, then the text originates with you, okay? This is the essential logic underwriting Casaubon. The problem is the ancients don't have that understanding of authorship, okay? What the ancient conception of authorship is if the ideas or the concepts embodied predominantly in whatever text that you're dealing with come from an identifiable source, then that's the source of it. So in other words, an ancient will sit down and write a text, and if he thinks that he's following or is actually following the teaching of any particular school, then he'll attribute the ideas and origins not to himself for, dressing them up, but to the original, what they regard as the original font for them. So in other words, what modern academics have done is they've gone back and they've pointed out that many of the ideas in the Hermetica are indeed very clearly drawn from ancient Egyptian religion, and they're simply dressed up in a Greek text. So in other words, they've more or less overthrown this whole idea of Casaubon, and that, simply because a word or several words in a text don't date from the time period that the ideas originate in doesn't necessarily mean that you're dealing with a text that in its central conceptual components is not very ancient. So if that's the case, then we have to go back to what the Hermetica actually say. They make the claim that they are coming ultimately from any ancient Egyptian wisdom that is traceable back to the wisdom god Tehuta, who, of course, the Greeks called Hermes. And if you look at the Egyptian text, Tehuta is often called the twice great, or so on and so forth. So it was very natural when Alexander conquers Egypt and brings all of his Greeks with him, and they start examining these Greek texts talking about Tehuta, that they identify him with Hermes. Okay, so there's that factor involved in all of this, but given the modern scholarship, basically they've thrown the door wide open again that these texts could indeed be, in some of their core elements, something traceable back to an antediluvian period of Egypt. And, when you say that, then you're immediately bringing up ideas of floods and Atlantis and so on and so forth. So, yeah, this has been an argument that's been going on for centuries, in other words, and it doesn't look like it's going to stop anytime soon. the Nazis, to kind of round out, and I'm going around Harvey's barn here for your question, but the Nazis certainly would have been aware of the text of the Hermetica. German scholars studied it just like British and French and Italian scholars studied it. So it's not something they would have been unaware of. I don't know of any extant document or evidence that definitely connects their Antarctic expedition to any Hermetic influence. But again, this is a case where they would have been guessing between the lines, much like we are, and thinking that, okay, if there's one place on Earth that fills the basic bill for Plato's Atlantis legend, then it would be Antarctica. Now, if I can have your indulgence and go on a little bit further as to how I've approached the Atlantis topic in my various books, because people have to understand my books are deliberately written in a certain order, and they all dovetail into each other. So in other words, you will find out quickly reading my books that I'm writing one big book, actually.
Yeah.
And you can read them in any particular way. I'm not saying that you have to read them in the order I intended. You can read them in any order you wish and still get profit out of them and see the connections. But the way I've handled the Atlantis myth is I'm doing one of those exercises where you say, okay, assuming what they say to be true, what are the implications? Well, if we go back and look at Plato and his dialogues where he's talking about Atlantis, he tells you very directly that he is repeating a story he heard from his uncle, who in turn had been initiated into the Egyptian mysteries by an Egyptian priest. So in other words, number one, Plato up front is telling you that you have to accept me on my word that I'm hearing this story, and that I'm not talking big allegories here, that I'm not making up fiction. And number two, if that's the case, you also have to reckon in the fact that if you're dealing with wisdom that's been handed down, it's been handed down probably in a form that is designed to both reveal and conceal wisdom over a prolonged period of time. So I've taken the Atlantis story to be kind of a multi-layered, deliberately constructed allegory that can be true on a multiplicity of levels. In other words, it may have a terrestrial solution. It may have an extraterrestrial solution, because we have to remember that for the ancients, terms like continents or mountains could be used interchangeably with planets. Terms like oceans were often, or abysses. The abyss was something that they used for actual physical oceans with lots of water. And it was also a term that they also used for space, for interplanetary space. It was, it was an ocean to them. So in other words, once you understand that the ancients are speaking in a multitude of levels at the same time, and approach the Atlantis story in that fashion, then it could be true on a multitude of levels. There could have been really a continent, but by the same token, it could be an allegory for a mountain or a continent that sank under the ocean. In other words, a planet that literally disappeared into the abyss of space. And this is the approach I basically took in my book, The Cosmic War. You have the idea that there was a planet in the solar system long ago that blew up. So, the way I approach the Atlantis story is that this is yet another one of those ancient mythologies that was deliberately crafted in a multi-layered way. And I think if you look at the Nazis, it's safe to speculate that perhaps they looked at that story in that way. And the reason I say that is that in 1935, Heinrich Himmler began to recruit people into the SS that had, let's just say, esoteric credentials. In other words, they were experts on occult lore, literature, legend, and so on. And eventually he establishes, I believe it was in 1940, he establishes officially, although this department actually existed prior to its official establishment. You find that pattern a lot in Nazi Germany. It's the German equivalent of plausible deniability. Okay, so you have a lot of these departments existing unofficially, but then there's a decree that officially establishes them. The SS, Heinrich Himmler, established a department within the SS called the Ahnenerbe-Dienst, okay, in German. That means the Ancestral Research Bureau, okay? And in the little memo or directive that he issued to establish this thing, this was a department set up solely to investigate occult lore, legend, literature, practice, of all types, no matter how loony it seemed. It was established to investigate every little last nook and cranny of what we would consider the occult or esoteric or alternative legend and lore for, and this is the key point, for its potential military application. So in other words, folks, what Nazi Germany is telling you is that it's the first modern great power of, that has technological sophistication that's deliberately going out and looking for a lot of ancient stuff for its potential military application. So in other words, we now have the weaponization of archaeology, if you want to put it that way.
Certainly do.
So, yeah, and to me, this is a clear signal that the Nazis suspect there's something up in those, so something is going on in these ancient texts that clearly indicate that there's a very sophisticated, very destructive technology that simply went missing when we blew ourselves apart in an earlier period of human history. That's now lost in the mists of prehistory and lost in these legends and texts and lore. So I think it's, given all of these kind of background circumstances, I think it's a plausible speculation to argue that, yes, they were going down to Antarctica to look for something, which they suspected may have been there. So, put that in the context of the fact that, Secretary of State John Kerry just made a little junket to Antarctica.
Right. Right. And Buzz Aldrin, right?
Buzz Aldrin, and when that story broke, I started getting all sorts of articles from people that thought, gee, this is strange. So they went out and investigated everybody else that had been to Antarctica. And lo and behold, it's a very strange list. We've got Prince Harry of Great Britain. We've got King Juan Carlos of Spain before he died, went to Antarctica. Wow. The Patriarch of Moscow a few months ago went to Antarctica.
Well, I just saw something about the Patriarch of Moscow. He performed some kind of ritual from
Well, that's a story that's out there on the internet. I don't give much credence to it. Russia itself is saying, well, he was down there to bless an Orthodox chapel for the Russian mission there, which, that's a plausible cover story. But the fact of the matter is any Orthodox bishop can go down there and bless that chapel. Why do you have to get the head of the Russian Orthodox Church to do this? And, do it after his meeting with Pope Francis on top of that. So,
Well, it's also not only Nazis that are down there now.
Right. It's a very strange list of people that have shown an interest in Antarctica. And, if you add it all together, Jeremiah, what you have is Hermann Goering, Rudolf Hess, John Kerry, Buzz Aldrin, Kirill III, Prince Harry, King Juan Carlos. That's a very bizarre list. And I don't know about you. That tells me there's something going on down there.
Yes.
And, they're not going down there just simply to study global warming data.
And John Kerry, he kind of had a celebratory look on his face when he looked like he was excited to go. Like it was very, it has the feeling that something was discovered. I mean, it's speculation.
That's the feeling it has too. Yeah. Hermann Goering is not going to be interested in climate change data. And, for John Kerry, that was the cover story the State Department put out. Well, John Kerry is the chief diplomat of the United States. He took that quote unquote detour during a diplomatic junket that he was on at the time. He could, he's the Secretary of State. He can make a phone call in Washington D.C. and get all the climate change data in the world that he could have wished for from Antarctica. He doesn't need to fly there. Mm-hmm. So that has all the appearance to me of being kind of a spin or a cover story of some sort being put out for what the real purpose is. And the same thing with Buzz Aldrin. He made that tweet before he went down there that, I'm ready to take off for the launch pad. And I thought, okay, well, on the one hand, he's just an astronaut and using astronaut language to say, I'm getting on the plane,
Right.
But the other way of interpreting that is I'm getting on the plane to go to the launch pad. So we're left speculating here, but everything on my suspicion meter tells me that, yeah, there's something going on down there, and they're not telling us about it.
Well, because in so much of the ancient text, you see reference to technologies that are lost, that are hidden, that
right.
You see it everywhere. I think you mentioned a really interesting epic called the Epic of Ninurta.
Yes.
I was wondering if you could bring some light onto that epic for us.
Well, the Epic of Ninurta I mentioned in my book, The Cosmic War, and let me say something very briefly about that book. That book I have always, and I have stated publicly for many years, and I regarded it in this fashion when I was writing it. That book is the keystone in the arch of my books. That's the book that I regard as kind of the central organizing principle for all the rest of them, if I can put it that way. In that book, I simply discuss the texts, particularly from Egypt, Mesopotamia, and related civilizations around them, that talk of an ancient cosmic war between the gods. And certainly the Mesopotamian texts are full of this stuff, the war between Marduk and Tiamat. And the Epic of Ninurta is one of the texts that appears to allude to this war. And I reproduced the entire text in the Cosmic War, and I did it for one fundamental reason. Pardon me. When you sit down and read that text, it's immediately clear that you're not reading an epic of any sort whatsoever. When I think of epic, I think of Homer, Iliad and the Odyssey. Right. But the last thing I would think of would be the Epic of Ninurta, because when you sit down and actually read the text, it's about as exciting as reading the index to a Sears catalog. And that's literally what it is. Mm-hmm. It's nothing but an inventory of the technologies that were recovered from the losing side in a war. That's all it is. It's like reading the report of the French and British military attachés on German war-making potential to the Treaty of Versailles. It's just about that exciting. Wow. And you sit down and read it, and you quickly discover that this is nothing but an inventory of some sort of technology that appears to be crystalline or at the minimum stone in nature. And it has four categories. Some of these technologies were taken off and used by the victors in other applications. Some of these technologies were studied. Some of them were destroyed. And then there's a fourth but very, very small category of a few of these stones, tablets of destinies, whatever you wish to call them. A few of these stones that could not be destroyed, and that appeared to have been referred to in the text as some sort of philosopher's stone, if you will, of weapons technology. And those were hidden. That's key. Those were hidden, according to the text. And once you acknowledge that, okay, if all of this is the case, And if indeed these ancients are talking about something that really happened in the only language that they knew how to talk about them, then you have to admit that somewhere on the surface of this planet, or possibly elsewhere, in nearby space, may be a cache of a lost technology, and with obvious military potential. So, put that in your thinking cap as you go back and recall what Heinrich Himmler said about the Ahnenerbe-Dienst. They had access to the same texts. And if they were reading them with these kinds of paleophysical or speculative scientific lenses, then it doesn't take much money to fund an archaeological expedition. In other words, the potential returns on investment for a minimum amount of risk are huge. So are you going to go looking for this stuff? Yeah. And, if you're the Allies and the Soviets and you win World War II and start looking at all these Nazi documents, are you going to spend a little money to see if perhaps they might have been right, or go out and try to find out what they were looking for when they were digging here or digging there? Well, sure you will. Sure you will.
And continue the digging, maybe.
And continue the digging, sure. Absolutely. I think, I make no bones about it. I've said in many of my books, I suspect that this may be a hidden reason for the sudden explosion in the Middle East. And it's very interesting. Let's go back and, just add one more little data point here to stir into our stew of speculation. Let's recall that prior to the American invasion of Iraq in 2003, what was the excuse that was invented? Well, we had to go in there and prevent Saddam Hussein from acquiring weapons of mass destruction. Then we go into Iraq and discover, oh, lo and behold, he's not making any. Okay. Well, most people tend to think of weapons of mass destruction, and it was certainly put out that way during that time period in terms of atomic, biological, or chemical weapons. But if you're thinking in a much broader picture, if you're painting on a much broader canvas, and realize that these ancient Mesopotamian epics, which are, of course, in Iraq, if you start thinking in terms of these ancient epics talking about, wars of the gods and blowing up planets and technologies that couldn't be destroyed, so they had to be hidden, then, you're going to go looking for it. Now, it's interesting that Saddam Hussein, of course, had German and French archaeological teams digging up all over Iraq. And, that again raises my suspicion meter into the orange zone that, why is he digging and why does he have the French and Germans digging for him? Okay. So you pile speculation on speculation, but eventually the fact remains the dots are connectable. And when you connect them that way, they do raise those questions, like it or not.
The Ninurta, was the tablet, what was that written in, a cuneiform, did you say?
Yeah, it was a cuneiform tablet. If I recall correctly, it was Akkadian. The tablet has been translated, for decades. The Stephanie Daly, I forget what her book is, Ancient Mesopotamian Text or something like that, has it. You can also find a version of it online. So it's been around, it's been known for a number of years. And I think, if I recall correctly, I reproduced the online version in the book because people will have more access to it that way. But I reproduced it so that people would actually sit and slog through and think, my word, this is probably the most boring thing I ever read. And it is, because it's not a story. It's not an epic. It's simply an inventory. That's all it is.
And I was going to say, what period of history do you think that was compiled?
Well, the text itself, if I recall correctly, was dated to about 6 to 4 centuries BC. In other words, the cuneiform texts themselves. But here again, you have to realize that dating of a tablet is not necessarily the same thing as the dating of the text. Okay.
Exactly. Mm-hmm.
The text itself, it's the old Hermetica problem. It's a story. It's a legend that's been handed down. And the text itself refers to these wars of the gods. So, in other words, if you compile I should say, if you compare the text to the interplanetary geological data and the celestial mechanics data, the idea of exploding a planet, Tom Van Flandern, the astronomer, wrote a book about the exploded planet hypothesis, the asteroid belt being the remains of an exploding planet, which is what astronomers thought when they first discovered the asteroids. He revived that hypothesis, and I think did a brilliant job of arguing in its favor, that there was some planet that's no longer there, that was blown up. Well, if you compare the two, then you would the earliest date possible in his thinking would have been about 3.2 million years ago. So in other words, if we had a sophisticated enough civilization that long ago to blow itself apart, then probably the only thing that's going to remain are stories about it. And of course, every classical civilization we know of, the Egyptians, the Mesopotamians, the Vedic civilizations in India, the South American native tribes and so on, have stories of wars of the gods. Mm-hmm. So, it looks to me, if you're willing to speculate a bit, that it may have been a real thing. That they're going out looking for this stuff. That's the bottom line. I think that's exactly what they're doing. They're actually looking for it.
And more than that, it seems like they're in a race against each other, right?
Yeah, so, I think you're right. If you look at another aspect of this story, and eventually I hope that I'll be able to look into it. I've been over the years trying to pierce the veil, but there's been enough clues that the Soviet Union was doing this during its existence, just experimenting in all sorts of very weird areas. And one of the things that they were doing was kind of following up on what the Nazis did. And I certainly think that the Western powers have as well. And the strangeness going on in Antarctica, this may be a part of the story. It may not be. I don't know. There's no evidence, but my intuition tells me it probably is. Okay. Because they're certainly keeping a tight lid on any sort of factual information, and they're publishing all sorts of nonsense as to why all these people are going down there. They're looking at something. There's no doubt in my mind.
And what it is, we're just not sure. Yeah.
But in the context of what I've been arguing in my books, I suspect that it has a great deal to do with this way of looking at some of these ancient texts, like the Epic of Ninurta, and they're actually looking for this technology. And I think that's yet another reason for our continued engagement in the Middle East. Ask yourself this. We were told when we went into the Middle East that this was all about securing oil. Well, America became more or less energy self-sufficient a couple of years ago. We don't need that Middle Eastern oil. And most people are even unaware of that. So why are we still there? I suspect that there are other pressing national security reasons that transcend, relationships with Israel or the traditional alliance with the Saudis and so on. I suspect that there's definitely something else afoot here, and they're never going to talk about it, because if they were to do so, it would sound nutty.
Right. It would. And do you feel like when you look into the ancient past that let's say it was a civil war, or there were two groups of people, two powerful forces that were at war with each other, or were there more? Do you feel like those two forces are still at war with each other?
I've always used the model. That's an excellent question. I've always used the model, and this is my basic thinking, that if there was indeed a destructive interplanetary war of some sort in this solar system, lost in the mists of prehistory, that the elites of both parties in that war are going to try, as they see the fact that, we've just blown our infrastructure for survival apart. What they're going to do is they are going to try to jumpstart and preserve as much of their knowledge as possible, and in doing so, try to jumpstart civilization again. So they're going to concoct carefully myths and legends that will endure over time, number one, so that the signal won't get lost in the noise of transmission. And number two, they're going to do it in such a way that as science advances again to their level of understanding, those texts will reveal more and more a scientific background rather than merely a mythological one. So I suspect, that's part of it, that you have two elites surviving that occasionally make common cause with each other without, at the same time remembering, hey, we just fought a war with these guys. So it's kind of like a mafia, if you want to look at it that way. The other thing I think is crucial here is that the texts themselves, particularly if you look at, Greek mythology, the Mesopotamian texts, even the Egyptian texts, hint that this is something that takes place within a huge extended family. So in other words, it's a civil war. And my model for talking about this ancient war is to think, to tell people, think of World War I. Kaiser Wilhelm II is the grandson of Queen Victoria of England. His mother was English. So therefore, this is why you see the Kaiser going so often to Great Britain. The Kaiser spoke English very well. Most people don't know that. You can actually go on YouTube and listen to an old Dutch radio broadcast of Kaiser Wilhelm II after the war when he was in exile in Holland and hear him talking English. And it's, a typical upper-class British English that he's speaking. But, he's related to the royal family in Great Britain. His cousin is king of England during the war. He's related by marriage to Tsar Nicholas II, and, related to most of the other royal houses in Europe, including the Habsburgs, the Savoys. So in other words, if you look at World War I in a certain sense, it's a big family feud. And, the result of it is, peculiarly, the only royal family that does survive out of the whole mess is the Windsors, or to give them their proper German family name, the House of Saxe, Coburg und Gotha. They changed their name to Windsor during the war because, everybody knew that the whole family was German. So, and we're fighting the Kaiser. The ancient texts are saying the same thing. You have this god fighting that god, but if you look at the family tree, so to speak, they're all related to each other.
Which account do you find to be the most revealing when it comes to Atlantis or the ancient past that you've read?
Well, if we assume that all of these texts are talking more or less in a very broad way about the Atlantis myth, the most compelling ones that I personally think that reveal this war and this relationship would be things like the Epic of Ninurta, the Edfu texts in Egypt, which you can't even get a hold of translations of those, to my knowledge, in any public form. You're still reliant on secondary sources, and I forget the name of the lady that. R.H. Reynolds or something like that, that published a book about the Edfu text, but nevertheless fascinating. Andrew Collins has published a bit about the Edfu text, but those texts, some of the Ugaritic texts, which is a civilization kind of at the northwestern end of the Fertile Crescent on up into Turkey. Some of those texts talk about it. Certainly some of the Vedic texts, again, the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, they talk about wars of the gods all the time. Wow. So, this is a fairly universal idea. And again, you get a whiff of that war in Plato's version of it because, he emphasizes over and over again that Atlantis was a very warlike society, made war on Greece and was ultimately defeated. So, the idea of war and Atlantis and advanced technologies are always kind of hovering, clustered together. And some of the South American Indian legends have some very interesting perspectives on it as well, particularly the legends surrounding Puma Punku and Titicaca in Bolivia. So this is a fairly widespread phenomenon. And the clincher here that takes me back to the idea that with the Atlantis mythology, and I'm speaking now not simply in terms of Plato's version, but the whole cluster of concepts around it. When you look at it and look at the Mesopotamian texts and realize that when you're dealing with the gods in Mesopotamian lore are closely associated with astrology. So in other words, many of the names of the gods are names of celestial bodies, planets, and so on. And they're always associated with mountains. Mountains become another, as I said before, another term for planets. But mountains are also the same word. And I forget now the Akkadian word for mountain. I should know that. I've been working too hard.
Yeah, you've been working too hard. That's why. Don't sweat it. Don't sweat it.
But the same word for mountain in Akkadian is the same word for a pyramid, for a ziggurat.
Wow.
So, look at that cluster of concepts now. They're all banded together: planets, gods, mountains, and pyramids, and war. So,
wow.
It's a very strange thing. And the bottom line for me, Jeremiah, is that, yeah, I do suspect that there's a kernel of truth lurking here in the middle of all these myths and civilizations in that part of the world, and the gigantic scale of their construction, the skill that was evident in that construction. And I'm not talking just about the Great Pyramid of Giza. I'm thinking of Baalbek. I'm thinking of Puma Punku in South America. These enormous structures that baffle engineers to this day. How did they do this? And do it with such precision that's difficult for us to reproduce to this day. So there's a technology here that we are simply, we're staring at the manifestation of that technology right in our faces.
And for those that don't know, Dr. Joseph Farrell, I think is a physicist or studied physics.
No, I have to correct the record. I am not a physicist. That was an error that was made by my publisher. He's since corrected that. But no, I am not an academic physicist at all. I'm simply a researcher.
Yes, but have you ever published academic paper on physics before?
No.
Oh, okay.
No. My only academic publications were in theology.
But compared to me, he's a physicist. How about that?
Well, look, we have to get over this idea that you have to have a credential in something to have an arguable opinion about it. Scientists are always making pronouncements about theology, so I don't have any hesitation to make pronouncements about their field. What I am is I'm a documents researcher, and I'm willing to speculate on the basis of a kind of take this proposition as a given, then what does it mean? That's what I'm doing. I'm taking the text more or less as the given that they are reporting as truthfully as they can in the language they had available on things that may have happened, and trying to examine them in a modern scientific context. And when you do that, it is clear that something is going on. And when you combine all of the data together, it's giving you a pretty good prima facie case, if I can use the legal term, that something happened. It may have been a war, and if it's a war and it was that destructive, then there's a technology behind it. And if there's a technology behind it, there's a civilization behind it. So, the argument is fairly clear.
Yeah. And from what you've read, this looks like an interplanetary war. Not that it was all local.
Right. It's an interplanetary war. One of the things, if people don't believe me, in the Cosmic War book, toward the end of the book, I point out, I have a picture of the moon of Saturn that's called Iapetus or Iapetus, all right? And this picture was taken by the Cassini probe as it approached Saturn. And next to that picture is a picture of George Lucas's Death Star from the Star Wars movies. And if you compare the two pictures, I defy anybody not to have their jaw on the floor.
Oh, no.
So, which is interesting because, of course, if it's a moon of Saturn, that raises the stakes again. Because Saturn, the planet, is Kronos in Greek. And when you examine the Greek mythology, where is the war of the gods fought and who's fighting it? Well, it's the Greek god Kronos. You know, the war of the Titans, the Gigantomachy. So, again, you know, you have to read these texts very, very carefully. They're multi-layered things. You must remember that the names of the gods are also names of planets. So what does that mean? The catastrophists think that this is simply an allegory of planetary collisions and acts of nature. I don't. I think that the names of the planets are like titular names. Okay? The Kronos being the name of whoever's in charge of Saturn at the time. And again, when you start piling up the evidences that many researchers have put out that certain features on celestial bodies in our solar system look disparagingly and discomfortingly artificial in their origin.
Oh, my.
Yeah, now you get the picture. If this is the case, then you're dealing, you know, and I think there's, again, enough evidence out there that prima facie allows one to hold that position as a rational position. Certainly it doesn't constitute proof because any picture can be doctored. But when you start finding more and more pictures, then either someone is pulling a big fast one over everybody's eyes, or we're looking at real remnants of something that was interplanetary and a civilization. And if you have that, then you have the possibility of an interplanetary war, you know, just like the text happened to say.
And it's so hard for people to believe, really is.
It really is. It is very difficult for people to believe it. You know, all I'm asking people to do is maintain an open mind, and look at the broad pattern of the evidence. And I say the broad pattern because, you know, once you start making these types of speculations, then you have to come up with a chronology. But once you start delving into the chronological problems and all the academic disciplines associated with them, then you realize what a huge task it is. So what I'm trying to do is I'm not trying to build the building. I'm simply trying to build the scaffolding. I'm trying to build the foundation and the framework, as it were, for the actual building to be built. But that's going to take, you know, it's beyond the capability of any one individual. That's really something that's going to take, you know, a lot of people over a long period of time, challenging each and every last aspect of the detailed paradigm of academic orthodoxy about ancient human history. You know, you can't say any more than this is some sort of prima facie case and leave it up to the individual reader to assess whether that case is a strong one or a weak one.
Well, Joseph, I wanted to ask you just a couple more things before you go. I wanted to ask you, what do you feel about do you have any thoughts about the Serapeum of Saqqara?
Oh, wow.
You know, have you seen this thing? I mean,
yes, I've seen pictures of them. And Chris Dunn has actually been there and studied them. These, again, are works that if you are approaching them from the standpoint of traditional Egyptology, that these things were produced by a civilization using copper saws, diorite balls, and slurry, and creating optical precision to within less than 1,000th of an inch, then, you know, I'm sorry, it takes like that that made me question the whole orthodox academic Egyptological paradigm to begin with, because that's an engineering absurdity, pure and simple. There's no other way about it. It's nonsense. If you look at these boxes, since they are built to such incredible optical precision, that raises the question, well, why do you need optical precision in these big boxes of stone? Which, incidentally, from some reports, appear to be resonant to certain frequencies in the sonic harmonic series. In other words, the audible harmonic series. So, these boxes, therefore, look to me, if you look at them with a physics eye, look to me to be some sort of resonating cavity of some sort. And if they're being built to optical precision, then a part of that resonating cavity must be for some purpose of an optical cavity. And once you say that, well, then you have to stop and think, well, what kind of optical cavity? Or what are we talking about here? Microwaves, and so on. So nobody has a clue, but we do have clues from the objects themselves that these things are measured with the precision and engineered with the precision that they do appear to be some sort of resonating cavity. My speculation, and people will recognize this that have read my book, Babylon's Banksters, my basic speculation right now is that these things may have been some sort of radio resonance cavity, and that the sonic properties are there because if you're going to engineer a simple way to transmit very weak radio signals, what you have to do is you have to stress that cavity somehow. And the way to do that would be sonically. So you'd have kind of a very, very simple mechanism made out of nonlinear material for the purposes of radio telegraphy. And I explore that whole hypothesis in my book, Babylon's Banksters, and again, in conjunction with an examination of statements in ancient texts that scholars typically have interpreted as just being kind of a mythological statement, because the people examining those texts have, been academics who specialized in classics, Latin literature, Greek literature, and so on. And therefore they don't realize that what they're reading is possibly a scientific statement, and therefore you might have to bring in an engineer to figure out just what the heck are they talking about. You see, so in other words, my other thing here, Jeremiah, is I'm very interdisciplinary when I write these books. You can't draw from just one academic field in order to understand these things.
Well, they are marvelous. They are marvelous boxes. They're fascinating, and I think they just reopened.
Yeah, that's my suspicion. A good one to have on, if you're interested in the Serapeum and in those boxes, would be Chris Dunn, because he's actually been there. I've seen his slides during his conference presentations where he takes out his engineers, calipers, and so on, that are in his line of work. They are required to be accurate to within a thousandth of an inch, and he puts these right angle calipers inside those boxes and cannot get a shred of light peeking through between his calipers and the boxes themselves. That's how finely engineered these things are. And again, that raises immediately the question, why do a bunch of Egyptians have to have boxes engineered and finished to that degree of optical precision? Well, that's because you need optical precision. So, that raises the idea that these things are somehow optical resonating cavities of some sort.
Well, what can you do with an optical resonating cavity? I mean, what would be...
Well, radio, for one thing.
Yeah, communication, right?
Sure, communication, right.
Over extremely long distances, like interstellar communication. No.
Well, you could do that. You could communicate with other points on planet Earth. In Babylon's Banksters, I point out that you have statements in Roman classical authors like Juvenal and so on and so forth that will say, just come right out and tell you that Roman general so-and-so in the fields somewhere sent to the emperor, in other words, asked for instructions, asked for orders, and received a response the next day. Well, this isn't going to happen with semaphores and fire towers and so on and so forth. This is too immediate for that. The Roman Empire is far flung. It's spread from, at one point in its history, all the way from Great Britain down to Mesopotamia, the Crimean Peninsula, Mm-hmm. So how do you keep an empire like that together and get orders to your armies in the field, and by the same token, maintain control over the wayward general, like Julius Caesar,
right.
So, Ptolemy, people like that.
Yeah.
So you've got a problem here, and communication is the key. And, if you look at statements like that from the standard academic approach, well, you say, okay, well, this, they obviously are shortening the time here to demonstrate Roman prowess. Or they had a really good semaphore fire signal tower system, and so on and so forth. Huh. But the obvious answer is they're building their temples in Rome, particularly the Roman Pantheon, which curiously, when you examine the floor pattern for the Roman Pantheon in Rome, it curiously resembles a modern radio device called the magnetron. So, there's all of these little things, these little clues that are there that indicate that maybe they had a very simple system of primitive radio telegraphy that was designed around their temples as optical resonating radio cavities. So, and there's more to it than that. I don't want to get into all the details so that people won't read the books, but
right.
But yeah, there are other ways to look at all of this stuff, and I think we just have to be willing to allow speculation about it and see where it takes us.
Mm-hmm. Well, I completely agree with that, Joseph, and I appreciate having you here. Now we're so happy to have you, and it's a real honor to speak to you. And well, I can wish you the best rest of the weekend, and I hope we get to speak again.
Sure,
you want to give out your website again, just in case, so people can see where to go get these books that you're working on?
Right. It's called www.gizadeathstar.com. That's all one word, GIZADEATHSTAR.com. There is a web store there where they can get my books off the website. They will come from Amazon. I have to tell people that, but I do get a few extra pennies on each book sale if they order via my website rather than directly through Amazon. And all of the books are, as far as I know, they're all up in the web store.
Okay.
And if they want to know the order that I publish them in, they can go to the website and look under the About tab. There's a short little biography of me, and then they can scroll down and see the list of books and the order that they were published in. But you can read them in any order. You don't have to read them in the order that I wrote them. Mm-hmm. Pick a subject that interests you and dive in.
Yeah. And well, have a good evening.
Thanks for having me back on.
Okay. Bye, Doctor.
Bye-bye.